Any university that's receiving grants, American taxpayers are compelled to fund, whether they like it or not. And so this is a violation of the intellectual freedom of taxpayers to exercise their own judgment about what ideas to support.
Suppose that you've got a private Catholic university and the theology department has a class on Catholic morality. Now you have the next, President AOC comes in and says, I find that this is offensive and of civil rights violation against the rights of women. Therefore, we need to put the theology department in receivership, and we need to cancel the scientific funding for the physics department down the hallway. Would people who support the Trump administration right now support President AOC in taking that kind of step, let's say, against Notre Dame? I bet they would see it for what it is, which is a really clear violation of intellectual freedom.
The issue here is to get force out of the whole area of higher education. Last month, the Trump administration suspended $400 million in federal research grants and contracts that were intended to go to Columbia University. They said that the grounds for this decision was that Columbia had failed to protect students during the pro-Hamas protests that took place at the university last year, and that it had violated civil rights law. Now, Columbia had the opportunity to restore these contracts, but in order to do that, they needed to make a set of changes that the administration demanded. There were a variety of things in this letter that the administration sent, but one that really attracted attention was the requirement for Columbia to put its Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies department under academic receivership, meaning that the administration would oversee the department more directly. This raises a question about intellectual freedom. Does the Trump administration's action violate intellectual freedom? Is it compatible with intellectual freedom? And how do government research grants in general affect intellectual freedom? Finally, there's a question of the taxpayers who may, for very good reason, no longer want their money to go to Columbia University. How can their rights be protected? We'll discuss these issues on today's episode of the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. I'm Sam Weaver, and with me today is Ben Baer. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Sam.
So I want to start by discussing some of the background on what kind of led up to this decision by the Trump administration, because I think it's really important for us to look back on what has gone on in Columbia University for the past couple of years. This is all of what's happening now is in the context of the anti-Israel protests that occurred at Columbia and other universities in the last couple of years, especially in 2024. At Columbia, we saw that protesters established one of these encampments on campus and eventually actually took over a building and had to be forcibly removed from it. The protests, the content, the slogans, the things that the protesters were saying often veered into being pro-Hamas and being anti-Semitic. And Jewish students at Columbia said that they were intimidated and harassed by protesters on campus. So this was a really serious turn of events, and it was something that we commented on extensively at the time when it was happening. One of the things that we emphasized is that there is no right to protest on university property, start an encampment, obstruct students, other students from going to campus, harass them. This is not something that you have a right to do on the campus of a private university. We argue that the protests should have been shut down by Columbia's administration because of the methods that they were using, regardless of the ideas that they were advocating. But also the ideas that were advocated by the protesters were evil. And they were siding with Hamas, with an organization of theocratic, genocidal terrorists who were attacking Israel. And we also commented on how these ideas that were advocated by Columbia's protesters are the product of ideas that are widespread in American universities today. Ideas like egalitarianism, multiculturalism, that are basically in their essence anti-West, anti-civilization. And we also supported university donors who, in the wake of these protests, decided to stop contributing to universities like Columbia and some other elite institutions. We endorse that idea of saying, I don't want my funds to continue to support a place where these ideas are taught or where these protests are tolerated by the administration. Universities don't have a right to donations. They don't have a right to funding by people who don't agree to support them. And the specific case of Columbia and some of the other universities where we saw these protests, I think it raises good reasons why people should not want to fund certain universities. So in coming to this story about Trump's actions this past month, I think it's important to be clear. I have no love for Columbia. I'm really critical of what they have been doing with their handling of the protests, with a lot of the ideas that come out of that university, including, as we'll talk about, with that department that the administration is targeting. And I'm very sympathetic with taxpayers who look at that series of events and say, I don't want my money to continue being sent to fund this university and to promote these ideas. But I am concerned about the intellectual freedom implications of the administration's kind of selective removal of this funding and placing conditions on its restoration. And I think it's worth talking about that in this case specifically, because threats to intellectual freedom usually start by targeting speech, ideas that most people wouldn't want to defend. The principle of intellectual freedom sometimes requires identifying threats to intellectual freedom when they threaten very unsavory speech.
Yes, and one thing that we're definitely not going to argue is that the speech of the protesters needed to be protected. I'm someone who did a number of podcasts on the Columbia protests, wrote an article that was published in a lot of newspapers on the subject, and the issue is not that they had a free speech right which they deserved to exercise. Free speech simply does not apply in the way that they were claiming that it did. It does make some difference whether we're talking about a public or a private university here, but like Columbia is a private university and they have an absolute right to protect their property and to set the terms and the rules on which it's used. And one of their rules was you can't disrupt classes, you can't break into buildings. They weren't enforcing their own rules, but they had the right to, and they had the right to kick these protesters off their campus to the extent that it was inconsistent with their rules. So there was no free speech, quote unquote, free speech right of these protesters to occupy buildings or parts of the campus interfering with their educational function. Even if we're talking about a public university, the public university, to the extent that it exists, is justified by some alleged need for public education. That's what justifies it, that function. And it doesn't exist to provide some kind of free speech forum for people off campus to come in and spout their views. So in most cases, it was completely justified for universities to kick protesters who were trespassing off of the campus. That they had no free speech right to do that. The problem, as we'll discuss, is that while that might be a short-term solution, almost no universities today are actually fully private. They're funded by federal money. We wouldn't be talking about what's now happening at Columbia if that weren't the case, because the federal government funds all kinds of aspects of the running of a private school like Columbia. And certainly public universities by their nature are run by public money. And the involvement of the government, whether in the private school or the public, creates other problems for intellectual freedom, for free speech. Some of the measures that government can take to deal with the recent problems on campus can make things worse. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Sam, you've I think been following the story more than I have. What can you tell us about what specific measures the Trump administration has aimed against Columbia and I guess against some other universities as well?
Yeah. So in the past month or so, the Trump administration has made some large and sudden cuts to federal research grants and contracts for a few different elite universities. And Columbia has been the big name in the news around this, but we've also heard about the University of Pennsylvania, in recent days, Harvard and Brown universities. Columbia is also the case where we know the most about what exactly has happened here, because the letter that the administration sent to Columbia explaining what they needed to do in order to have their funding restored has been published, whereas we don't really know a lot about the communication between the administration and some of those other universities. In the case of Columbia, it was $400 million of grants and contracts that were stopped, canceled. And one thing that's important to note is that even though a lot of what the administration or a lot of what the story has been focused on is this Department of Middle Eastern Studies and these other studies, but I'll just use that for shorthand. Even though that's the department that has been at the center of a lot of scrutiny, these contracts and grants were not all aimed at that department, or even most of them aimed at that department. It was funding for research throughout all of Columbia. In particular, I found that $250 million of National Institutes of Health grants were stopped for Columbia. So these are grants that are funding medical research and studies on cancer and the treatment and prevention of various diseases. There are a number of other projects, environmental research, these sort of things when you read the news reports on what kind of examples are coming up. So all sorts of different research across the university's various departments. Now, the reason that was given by the Trump administration, and you can see this in the letter that they sent to Columbia, is that they claim Columbia has violated the Civil Rights Act. It has failed to protect students from anti-Semitic harassment or even violence on campus.
We do know, I guess, March 10th, the Department of Education released a kind of open letter to 60 universities making similar charges about civil rights problems. And we don't know the content of the communications with the specific schools, just a list of schools in that case. But here's the way I think about the civil rights aspects of this. So certainly, if universities elect to receive federal funding, at least as a matter of the law, they are going to be subject to the provisions of the Civil Rights Act that tie federal funding to civil rights compliance. And the letter to Columbia mentions both Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The Title VI is the one specifically about conditions for federal funding. And so it says, if you want to receive federal funding, including for education, for research, et cetera, then you've got to comply with their understanding of what a non-discriminatory environment looks like. And so it certainly seems legally sound to investigate them, at least, for violations, if in fact failing to prevent harassment of Jewish students counts as a kind of discrimination, which it may well. I should mention the Biden administration itself began a Title VI investigation against Columbia in 2023. So it's not like this is the first time anybody's noticing that there's an issue here. Of course, the question that we're going to end up exploring, Sam, is whether government should even be in the position in the first place to be offering the kind of strings attached aid that make this provision of the civil rights kick in the first place. There are big intellectual freedom questions there. But there are other aspects, Sam, of the Trump administration's letter and the threats that it's making, which I think raise some eyebrows. So what have you seen about that?
Yeah, so in this letter, the Trump administration gave a whole list of changes that Columbia needed to make to even have a chance of having their funding resumed. And most of these were administrative reforms, changes to disciplinary policies, changes to admissions policies. Some of them a little bit unclear exactly what the request, what the demand was in the letter. Some cases, it was like you need to enforce your own policies about protests and actually punish people who violate them. But one of those bullet points really stood out and has caught a lot of attention, and it certainly caught my attention as well, which was the the demand that the university place the Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies Department under what's called academic receivership for a period of 5 years. And receivership is where a university places a department under the control of someone in the administration who's not a professor in that department. It's usually done when a university concludes that a department has a serious problem. It's being seriously mismanaged. But that's usually a decision that, certainly in a private university, would be made by the administration of the university itself, not by the federal government. And now this department, when you look at what some of those professors in that department had said and had published, there are some things that people understandably found very reprehensible. And it came out in the period of the protests that there was one professor in that department who wrote an article that seemed to be celebrating the October 7th attack on Israel, the terrorist attack that involved the killing of thousands of civilians. So some very bad ideas coming out of that department. But it's certainly an unusual thing for the federal government to be demanding that a private university place a department under receivership like this. And Columbia has, it seems, given in to these demands. They've released this letter where they explained what changes they're making, and it seemed to pretty much align with all of the things that the Trump administration had asked them to do in the letter, including, it seems, placing this department, not just placing it under receivership, but their letter indicates that they're planning to make some changes to curriculum in that department. They're talking about adding more viewpoint diversity, adding new courses or new lectures to sort of balance out or change the way that Israel is presented and described in this department. So it seems like Columbia is making some academic changes, or at least they're promising to, in response to the Trump administration's letter. Now, this receivership issue in particular has elicited a lot of commentary from advocates of free speech, intellectual freedom, and also what people call academic freedom, which is a concept that we're critical of and we'll talk about more a little bit later. But I think that this does really raise some important issues about the whole principle of intellectual freedom as it applies to the Columbia case. And as we've already sort of alluded to, there's I think kind of a general question here about federal research funding as such. Is that whole enterprise of having the federal government fund research compatible with intellectual freedom?
Yeah, Sam, since the question here is fundamentally about the effects of these policies on intellectual freedom, which I think you're rightly distinguishing from so-called academic freedom, it's worth saying a word or two just about what we mean by intellectual freedom. This is shorthand for what all of the rights in the First Amendment have in common with each other, and any other rights that involve the same principle. So what do rights to free speech, assembly, the press, worship, what do they have in common with each other? If you think about it abstractly, they all, in one way or another, protect the needs of a free mind for living in a world with other people. A free mind needs to be able to communicate with other people. It needs to interact with other people in order to judge for itself what's actually true. These are the rights that are coming out of the Enlightenment tradition, thinking about what's necessary for a rational being to live in a society. And what are those needs? Well, a mind is not a disembodied entity. It lives in a body. It needs to be able to use its own body and its own resources to express itself in order to interact in certain physical spaces with other people who also consent to do the same thing. We gain knowledge by talking with other people, by interacting with other people, by getting feedback, agreement or disagreement with them. And so that's what intellectual freedom is about. And one of the places in which intellectual freedom can be exercised is in educational institutions. So it's clearly something that is at stake at something like a place of higher education, a college or a university. How a university is governed, how it is funded also has serious implications for whether or not intellectual freedom is being exercised.
Yeah. So one thing that is, I think, really worth underscoring here about the state of play in higher education, and in particular in research today at universities, is that the federal government is a major funder of academic research in American universities. I mean, looking at federal statistics, what I found is that the federal government in the fiscal year 2023 funded over $59 billion of research at universities. That was around 55% of the total money spent on research at universities. So over half of research in American universities is funded by the federal government. And Columbia, like many elite universities, is a particularly major recipient of the kind of grants and contracts that the federal government gives for research. In 2023, over 75% of Columbia's research expenditures for that year were funded by the federal government. So Columbia is the majority of their research by a significant margin is federally funded. And these grants that the federal government gives, they're given through a few different departments and a few different kind of entities within the executive branch. Typically, it's an entity like the National Science Foundation or National Institutes of Health that has a certain kind of budget each year to spend on grants, and they get tons of applications each year, and they go through this kind of process that involves a certain amount of review by experts in a relevant field and some decisions by people in the federal bureaucracy, and they decide out of all of these applications that they get, who's going to get funded, who's going to get their project covered by the federal government or partially funded by the federal government. And I think what's important to understand from a philosophical perspective about this whole approach to the way that research operates in universities is that it inevitably involves force being injected into the realm of the intellect, into the realm of science, research, and ideas. And to highlight this, I want to read a quote from Ayn Rand's essay, The Establishing of an Establishment, where she actually wrote about the issue of government grants for research. Here's what she said. The fundamental evil of government grants is the fact that men are forced to pay for the support of ideas diametrically opposed to their own. This is a profound violation of an individual's integrity and conscience. A little later, she says, the Constitution forbids a government's establishment of religion, properly regarding it as a violation of individual rights. Since a man's beliefs are protected from the intrusion of force, the same principle should protect his reasoned convictions and forbid governmental establishments in the field of thought. So I think what's powerful about this quote, what she's calling attention to here is the principle of separation of church and state that is well known as part of the American political system, the American Constitution and Bill of Rights, properly should apply much more broadly. The same principle applies to government promotion of any ideas, any sort of intellectual content, for the same basic reasons, that it's compelling people to fund the promotion of certain ideas, which they may or may not agree with. And so this is certainly what's happening in government research grants. I mean, the federal bureaucracy is they're choosing which research projects get funding and funding them with money taken from taxpayers. So all Americans are compelled to fund the research projects that are chosen by the National Science Foundation or one of these other agencies, whether or not they agree or disagree with a specific project, or whether they support or oppose the mission or the practices or the content of a specific university where that project is taking place. And that's certainly become relevant with Columbia and some of these other universities where we've seen these protests. But American taxpayers are still compelled to fund a university like Columbia through the mechanism of these research grants, or any number of other universities. Any university that's receiving grants, American taxpayers are compelled to fund, whether they like it or not. And so this is a violation of the intellectual freedom of taxpayers to exercise their own judgment about what ideas, what research, what institutions to support.
And Sam, one of the things someone might object to here is to say, well, okay, the protesters were out of line. They should have been kicked out. But why have an objection to Columbia? Because of what the protesters are doing, especially when they're breaking Columbia's rules. Maybe you should object to Columbia not kicking them out sooner. Fine. But why question the funding of the university? And yet, it's still the case that most of the students who are participating in these protests are Columbia students. There's some probably outside infiltrators, but most of them were students. And here it's important to emphasize that the intellectual freedom violation is not just at the level of federal research money that's supporting medical research at Columbia, an institution that happens to have some misbehaved students. It's that many, if not most of these students are themselves receiving federal money under the heading of student loans, federal student loans administered by the Department of Education to pay the university. And so the problem is even wider than just research money, grant money, et cetera, for various departments. If we're talking about a public university, then to some degree, student tuition is supported by taxpayer money directly. The rest is then, if not paid privately by the student, then also by student loans. But even in private universities, a huge component of what students are paying their tuition money with is federal student loan money, which maybe they'll pay back someday, but in the meantime, it's coming from taxpayers. And it's not even clear that it goes through the hands of the students. So if it's like me, the money, I never see any of that money. It goes straight from the Department of Education to the university. And so it's not even clear that it's the students' money at any point along the way. And so that involves the same offense. Why is it that some students who have these horrific ideas get to, in effect, be funded by taxpayers? They get to live in New York City. They get to go to fancy classes where they learn ideas that then encourage them to go on offensive anti-Semitic pro-Hamas rants. So it's not just the issue of the research and grant money. It's the whole setup. And I should mention, this raises a reasonable question, which is, why is it only research money for cancer that's being targeted and not the rest?
I mentioned this essay by Ayn Rand called The Establishing of an Establishment. And one of the main point that she's trying to argue in that essay is that the whole system of government grants promotes a sort of orthodoxy in all of the academic fields that become very heavily funded through these federal grants. And her point was, this is something that happens by the nature of the process by which any government entity decides whose grant gets funded and whose doesn't. And I think what's powerful about her explanation here is that it's not built on the assumption that there is mass corruption within these federal departments, that it's corrupt bureaucrats making sort of decisions that benefit their buddies or something like that, although that is something that can happen. Her point is that even if government officials try to do their very best to award grants based on merit, they have to ultimately rely on leading experts, people who are already established as experts in whatever field they're deciding a grant for. I mean, bureaucrats in the national, any of these National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation, nobody in that organization can be a universal scholar, can be an expert in all of the different fields where they get grant applications all the time. They have to turn to experts, whether hire them into those bureaucracies or appeal to outside experts to help them evaluate the different grant proposals that they're getting and determine which ones actually represent promising research. It ends up perpetuating the type of research and ideas that are already seen as right or important by the leading experts in a particular field. And this is the idea of that title, establishing of an establishment. It establishes a particular kind of group of people with similar ideas, similar interests, similar convictions within any field that is dominated by this kind of federal funding. And the result of this is that it's very difficult for someone who has an unorthodox take on a field, wants to research in an area that isn't considered important by the leading lights of the field, or has a different perspective or a different viewpoint on the field, to break into the profession and to get published and to do their research. And so this in itself, it part of the point in that essay is it's not censorship in the sense that the government is going in and saying you can't speak, you can't publish, you can't write, but it's a way by which federal force distorts the field and builds this sort of orthodoxy around a set of established views.
And it's noteworthy that it's an orthodoxy that, you know, people who are funding it through their tax money in many cases find offensive. And that's where the intellectual freedom violation is coming from. And it's worth flagging that, because if people often observe, like, there's this academic bubble. It's like they're in this ivory tower. They're completely detached from the concerns and views of regular Americans. And they wonder, how does this happen? And sometimes there are conspiracy theories about how this happens, but it's really all out there in the open. It's this establishing of an establishment system whereby, because they have to use what's the kind of standard of prestige in a field, they look to the consensus view, and then that consensus view gets reinforced and builds on itself, perhaps without noticing how much at odds it is with the rest of the world's view. But that's inherent in the nature of a system that's set up by government force. And so if you want to solve that problem, if you're concerned about that bubble on that ivory tower, you've got to think about, well, what created it in the first place?
And to kind of turn specifically to the Columbia case and what the administration's doing here, I mean, one of the things that has been raised by critics is that the administration claims that they're taking action against Columbia for violating civil rights law, but they don't seem to be following the process that the government is supposed to follow when they accuse an institution that's receiving federal funding of violating that law. The usual process, it seems, requires them to notify the institution, give them a chance to get in compliance with that law, and ultimately to have a hearing that determines whether or not they actually have violated that law and failed to respond to attempts to get them to comply with it. That's not what the Trump administration seems to be doing here. It's they cut off the funding, and now there's a negotiation where if you do these things, maybe you'll get it back, and that's the phase that the situation seems to be in right now. And I think also that, plus the fact that there is this point about putting this department in receivership, indicates that what is going on is something more than just, did you or did you not violate civil rights law, and are we following the process to see whether you should continue getting federal funding? It's something more like the administration is pressuring Columbia to adopt certain policies and specifically to change the teaching, change the content of this particular department.
Yeah, and I think this would be a concern if there'd be a rule of law concern here, simply if the administration weren't enforcing the civil rights law in the usual objective way. And what that involves, as I understand it, is there needs to be an investigation, there needs to be finding of facts, there needs to be reports written, there's a hearing, and then forceful action can be taken against the institution in question only if voluntary means are not successful. It's not, since the investigation only began about a year ago, it's not clear if that whole process has been undertaken. I mean, that would be a problem all by itself, but I think it's an even worse problem, a problem that rises to the level of a concern for intellectual freedom, if the enforcement action is being taken on ideological grounds. That is, where the government is taking sides on a question of ideas. And that's true, by the way, even if we think that the idea is good. That is to say, we may agree that anti-Semitism is bad, and that expressing support for terrorists, siding with them against Israel, we might think that that's a really bad thing too. Nevertheless, that's an ideological conviction, and a government that is concerned with protecting the rights of its citizens, including its citizens' intellectual freedom, can't take sides on questions of ideologies, even ones that we like. And part of that, I think, means it can't arbitrarily enforce civil rights law in favor of ideas that it likes, but not in the ones that it doesn't. So, for example, as much as we might despise anti-Semitism, the government should not be able to arbitrarily enforce civil rights law, that is to say, bypassing all these processes just when it comes to favoring Jewish students, but let's say not when it comes to trying to enforce against anti-Black discrimination. That is then not just a rule of law problem, it's a problem with intellectual freedom. And I should mention this is parallel to a point with regard to campus protests. So as long as there are public universities, a question we'll discuss in a moment, but as long as there are public universities, their purpose is education. Their purpose is not to serve as a free speech forum. And so governments need to at least try to govern them and enforce the boundaries of the university in accord with that function. And so that means they can be justified in kicking out student protesters who show up on the campus of UCLA, for example, when it goes against their rules and when it interferes with the function of education, as it often does. But if you have an institution like University of Texas at Austin, just down the road from me, well, a few years ago, the state of Texas passed a law saying university facilities and land can and should be used for free speech, quote unquote, purposes. And so their own law, perhaps a misguided law, I suspect, but their own law said, we're going to enforce free speech rules, which is to say, we're not going to take sides about ideas on the use of university property. Now, however misguided that idea may have been, once it's the law, then if you start saying, well, we're going to kick out certain protesters but not others, you again have an intellectual freedom problem. In fact, that is exactly what they did. They did kick out the pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protesters, which if they hadn't said anything about their reasons for doing it, might well have been fine. But the Governor Abbott, tweeted saying anti-Semitism will not be tolerated on UT campus, which then puts it into the realm of we're siding with one idea versus the other, which is then an intellectual freedom violation. And so you might argue that they might have been justified if they hadn't given that ideological reason. But once they said, no, we're taking sides with ideas, and if somebody wants to come in and protest Hamas, we won't kick them out even if they do the same things. That's a real problem. So government can't take sides with ideas, and yet it seems to be it was doing that in the case of the U Texas protest. It looks like it might be doing that with regard to this receivership with the Columbia Department as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of how I think about this particular case in the broader context of federal grants, because there's a sense in which federal grants, not a sense, they do involve the government taking sides on certain issues of ideas. They decide, they have two grants applications in front of them, and they decide this one is more worth funding than the other. They're taking sides on the issue of what scientific research is worth funding. But the action that the administration is taking now with Columbia, I think, is adding a new element of taking sides on ideas on top of what was already sort of baked into the grant process. And I think it's an insidious type of new element, because the point is that now, if you're going through if this precedent is sort of established where the administration can pull funding from grants for a whole university on the basis of one department in the university teaches some ideas that the president disagrees with or thinks is bad, what that establishes is your grant, whether your grant gets funded or not, is now not just dependent on the judgment of the government appointed experts in your field. It's dependent on that, going through that whole process of applying for grants and getting approval from the experts in the National Science Foundation. And then also, you could just arbitrarily basically get the grant pulled from you based on the government not liking what someone else at your university in a completely different department is saying. And so that it involves the government in taking sides in a big way on these political issues, not just the kind of way it was already doing that in grant applications.
Yeah, I think the way to think about this is that the old system, the system of government sponsors a university, the university hires some people who are going to decide who gets hired based on what's prestigious in a field, is an intellectual freedom violation for all the reasons we've talked about, because still it's going to end up causing some people's ideas to be to be unrepresented. Meanwhile, their tax money is going to support ideas they don't agree with. But it at least puts some kind of distance between the government doing the funding and the administrators doing the hiring. What we have now is something different. We have instead, or at least what it's starting to look like, what this latest action with Columbia portends, is a kind of direct oversight of curriculum by the executive. And that then means it's not just a kind of indirect taking of sides, where the government's indirectly taking sides with a certain idea. It's now a direct picking of winners and losers. And that is about as direct of an intellectual freedom violation as you can get. It's also just then a lot more arbitrary. The past system might have been arbitrary because you're using the kind of unavoidable standard of having to look at what's prestigious in a field. But now a whole field can end up getting restrained or canceled or what have you because of some kind of ideological disagreement between the executive and the administrators. And even the scientists who are working in a completely unrelated field but who happen to be at the same institution end up losing their funding because of it. They shouldn't be getting that funding, as we'll say, but this is an arbitrary and much more concerning way of dealing with the problem. And just to concretize this, I mean, think about how the same kind of policy could and likely would get applied by a left-wing administration if they continue the same kind of policy. So there are right now a lot of private religious universities that still get lots of federal funding, both for research, scientific and other kinds of research, including the humanities, and they get, of course, the federal funding of student loans. So suppose that you've got a Catholic university, private Catholic university, and the theology department has a class on Catholic morality, where they teach about how the Catholic position is against abortion and homosexuality and what have you. And now you have the next, President AOC comes in and says, I find that this is offensive and of civil rights violation against the rights of women. Therefore, we need to put the theology department in receivership, and we need to cancel the scientific funding for the physics department down the hallway at the Catholic University. Would people who support the Trump administration right now support President AOC in taking that kind of step, let's say, against Notre Dame? I bet they wouldn't. I bet they would see it for what it is, which is a really clear violation of intellectual freedom, in particular religious freedom in this case. And yet that is what they would be able to do if that same kind of policy were then adopted by the next administration. I think it's important for people to think about what happens when someone who doesn't have your ideas on the other side ends up applying the same kind of policy. There it's somewhat clearer perhaps to you that there's a violation of a fundamental freedom involved. And yet same thing's happening here, even if we like the ideas that the administration is siding with.
To say something before we end about the issue of academic freedom, which is an objection that's been raised by a lot of critics of this move by the administration. And the reason I wanted to do that is we've been talking throughout about intellectual freedom, as this is the principle of people having the right to think, to express ideas free of force. That's to be distinguished, I think, from the academic freedom issue that is being raised by a lot of critics of the administration now. Because academic freedom, and I kind of put that in scare quotes, is not really something, it's not really a conceptualization that makes sense, or is something that makes sense to say that professors have or should have. I mean, the way that academic freedom is usually presented is that professors should be able to teach or write or say whatever they want. Institutions, the administration of the university, should not be able to exert any control over that. This is not the right principle to be raising here. It's not a principle that makes sense. And it confuses the issue, I think, because if we're talking about a private university, a private institution, that institution has its own intellectual freedom. It has the right to decide what ideas to sponsor with its own money, or to what people to host, to speak on what topics. And so in a private institution of higher education, the administration should have the ability to decide what professors to hire, what classes they should teach, what kind of speech or what kind of publications they're going to endorse and they're going to allow their employees to do while they're still employees. But that's in the context of a private institution. And so the reason why it's confusing, why it's a problem to raise this kind of conceptualization of academic freedom in this context, is that academic freedom, as it's typically understood, actually violates intellectual freedom, because it's built on this idea that academics should just be entitled to receiving funding to teach whatever they want, write whatever they want, say whatever they want, even if private donors disagree. And part of the whole issue of why federal grants violate intellectual freedom is that they involve compelling taxpayers to fund certain ideas that are chosen to receive grants. And so the essential issue here is force. The issue is whether people voluntarily agree to fund a certain institution, a certain grant, a certain professor, a certain idea, or whether they're being compelled to fund it against their will. And that principle has to be understood, and it's not well understood today and applied here. And that's different from this idea of academic freedom that's often raised.
Yeah, I think it's a good formulation to say that the way, at least, that today's professors conceive of quote-unquote academic freedom is a violation of the intellectual freedom of the taxpayers. And it certainly will be so as long as their salaries are being funded in one way or another by government money. But I also think it's true that, like, the kinds of concerns we've been raising about the way the Trump administration is handling this, the ways in which that's a violation of intellectual freedom, also involves the violation of the intellectual freedom of the universities and the professors. And this is not contradictory. I think there are intellectual freedom violations all around now because of the current situation. As long as education is sponsored by the taxpayers, two things are going to be true. One is that the government's going to have to make certain kinds of call about what does and what doesn't serve the function of education. The other thing is that government can't and should try not to sponsor one idea over the other. But these are just two things that are completely at odds with each other. They're contradictory purposes. You can't both try to make a judgment call about what serves educational functions without supporting certain ideas at the expense of others. You simply can't. And so in the current system, if you pay taxes and they're going to support education, your intellectual freedom is being violated. And also, if you receive tax money as a professor, you're likely to then have your intellectual freedom violated, not your academic freedom, but you've made a plan, you've agreed to teach something, you wanted to teach something with an idea that you had, someone's paying you to do it. Now the government comes along and says you can't do it anymore, your plan has been frustrated. That's an intellectual freedom violation too, because now your idea is, you're being persecuted because of your idea, government's taking sides with a certain idea. And so it's just intellectual freedom violation on every side. And there is really no good solution to the problem in the current system. And so it's a reason why the system has to change. And so, Sam, what can we do? What's the way out of this?
Yeah, I mean, the problem that is behind all of these violations of intellectual freedom all around is force. And so the issue here is to get force out of the whole area of higher education, to move in the direction of a system where universities, research, all of it is funded by people who voluntarily decide to fund those organizations. And that can obviously take a variety of different forms. It can take the form of tuition paid by students who decide to go there and therefore pay the university. It can take the form of donations from alumni or other private donors who believe in the organization, its mission, and want to sponsor its work. But the key thing is voluntary, that people are able to decide whether or not they want to be involved with an institution, whether or not they want their hard-earned money, their resources to be used for the propagation of whatever ideas that university decides to teach and decides to promote. And so in that context, if enough people object to an institution like Columbia and say, I don't want anything to do with this anymore, they can decide to boycott. They can pull their funding. And if enough people do that, Columbia might decide to make a change to its direction in order to attract more donors. On the other hand, if there's another university out there that donors see value in and say, yeah, this university has a mission, they're doing research, they're doing teaching that I think is good, they can decide to go and contribute to that institution and fund that institution. And so that kind of situation is the only way to protect intellectual freedom for all involved in this situation, for taxpayers, professors, academics, students, everyone involved. Now, obviously, we can't get there tomorrow. The system is so deeply pervaded with force. The government funding and the grants are so deeply enmeshed in the way that higher education works today, to say nothing of the student loans, how involved they are in how students pay for education, that you can't convert from that to a completely free system overnight. But people who are concerned with this issue, concerned with protecting intellectual freedom, should advocate phasing out federal funding of higher education across the board. And I think you can do this in a way that does not get the government involved in taking sides on ideas, taking sides on intellectual issues. So don't just defund Columbia because they said something particularly offensive, but phase out funding for all universities on some sort of step-by-step plan. You're not cut it off overnight necessarily, but move towards phasing that out over the long run and converting towards a system where everything is privately funded. This is the direction that I think is necessary if we're to restore intellectual freedom to the whole realm of higher education. And of all the realms where intellectual freedom should matter, I mean, that's a really important area where we should take that seriously and move towards restoring it.
And there's another lesson and possible recommendation, not just for the government here, but for universities. If universities today sense that their intellectual freedom is now beginning to be threatened by an administration that wants to cancel certain viewpoints because of ideological disagreement, universities have an option here too. They can start to refuse federal funding. And this is not a pie in the sky idea. This is something that some universities have actually done. So Hillsdale College in Michigan Grove City College, both of them some decades ago when the civil rights legislation was beginning to be implemented with regard to higher education, realized if we take federal funding, if we take research funding, even if we take student loans, then government will be able to have a say over our curriculum, will be able to come in and manage us just like they're trying to do to Columbia now. And so we had better get out of the federal money business. And they did. And they said, we're not going to accept any federal funding. And so now, Hillsdale is this religious conservative college, which I disagree with a lot of the stuff that they produce these days, but nobody is going to come after them. And nobody can come after them with what they teach because they were unwilling to take this federal funding. That is an option that more private universities, I think, should be starting to consider. And they don't have to go cold turkey either. They could start to phase out what they accept. And we're going to go on a schedule for however many years, and we'll take fewer and fewer dollars each year, lower percentage of student loans or what have you, if they want to escape the oversight of President Trump or future President AOC. I think that's what they need to do.
I agree. So I think we should wrap up for our discussion today. But before we go, I wanted to mention some resources that you might want to look at if you're interested in investigating this issue further. The first two are a couple of essays from Ayn Rand that we mentioned during the discussion and are really relevant to this topic. One is The Establishing of an Establishment. This is the one where she talks about the issue of government grants and how it leads to intellectual orthodoxy. And the second one is Fairness Doctrine for Education. And that's the proposal that she had to, as a sort of temporary solution or a temporary way of at least lessening the issue of intellectual orthodoxy in universities, to have a sort of fairness doctrine put forward by the courts to have representatives of opposing views in universities that are federally funded. Those are both, by the way, in the book Philosophy Who Needs It. So you can find those in that collection. A couple other resources I wanted to mention. So one is an article that we published on New Ideal called More University Donors Should Go Galt. This is in reference to the university donors who decided to pull out of the funding of universities after the pro-Hamas protests took over campuses. And finally, a podcast that, Ben, you and I did a couple of years ago about a sort of other kind of related issue in higher education in the state of Florida. That episode was called DeSantis's Push to Ideologically Transform Florida Colleges. So check those out if you're interested in investigating the topic further. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can always click the bell to get notifications for live videos or for new recordings. And we always appreciate it if people like, comment on, or share the episode. It helps us with the algorithm to attract new viewers. Same thing if you're on other platforms such as Facebook. Finally, if you have any questions or comments about today's episode, or if you have ideas for topics we should cover in future episodes, please do email us at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your emails and we reply to many of them. All right, thanks for watching, and thanks, Ben, for this discussion.
Thanks, Sam.